Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Orbit. And today I'm very excited to talk to Carla Bergman, who is one of the authors of Joyful Militancy, which I read a couple months ago. Really liked it. And I managed to interact with you on Twitter. I was so surprised. Do you have like a notification for whoever talks about Joyful
Um,
Militancy?
I don't. I'm not that tech savvy.
Okay.
I look up the hashtag now and again.
Oh, nice.
And then I can't remember if it was when you did the book report or whatever, but I liked what you said. So,
Thank you. I'm
so
glad to
thank you
hear
for
it.
reading though. We really appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, the way it came about, I was in Portland and one of my friends was reading it on his balcony. And I was like, wow, that's such a good title of a book. And he says, yeah, this is actually, it's really helpful to a lot of the protest stuff that I've been doing. And it's been going around circles in his friend group. So we started a little book club and started reading it.
Oh,
Um,
that's really nice.
yeah, I thought it was a nice organic way of finding the book. Uh, but about you, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and tell us a little bit about your early life.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. I don't know when this is going to air, but thank you for having me during the dumpster fire that's ongoing elections in the USA. Just wanted to acknowledge that.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I live on Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, which is also known as Canada, Vancouver specifically. And I'm a mom, a parent to a 26-year-old and a 16-year-old. Um, I write a
Vancouver
bit.
your whole life.
Um, no, more Vancouver Island, which is
Okay,
called,
gotcha.
yeah, for a big chunk. Alberta for early years, lived in Toronto for a bit, but mostly here, yeah. Especially, as an adult and doing the family thing has been mostly here. Yeah.
Nice. How did you get into, I guess, the path that led you to write Joyful Militancy? Was it activism? How did you get
Yeah,
into
it's a
this field?
it's a bit of a story. It's actually it starts from a pretty personal place. I I like to put it into some context around. So I was studying philosophy. I was actually in college doing a degree in peace and conflict studies, and actually majoring in genocide studies. So really devastating work. And researching genocide and stuff every day. So it was just the opposite of joy.
Right.
So I just wanted to put that context into place. And then I dropped out of that because it was really intense. And I moved, that was in Toronto, and I moved back to Vancouver and just took a philosophy class on a whim. And it just so happened that the professor was just a Spinozian, I guess, a Spinoza fanatic. And so we read a bit of him, and it's one of these seeds planted, right? Because he talks a lot about the passions, this idea that joy is something that is not just an emotion. It enables us to act and be more, and it's just bigger than just a tiny emotion or emotion, a big emotion. And it just
Hmm.
includes a lot of things. And so that was kind of a seed. And at the same time, I was rereading The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. And she also, there's so many quotes in that book about how she defined joy. And so it just was another seed planting that through struggle, through some of our hardest times in life, joy is this powerful affect or thing that can just rise up in ourselves and enable us to reach our own power and to do more. Um, uh, and then at a personal level, I was going through a really challenging time. I got diagnosed with an illness, some family trauma, and I kept saying, like, I have a belly full of joy no matter what. And I just kept talking about, and so at that moment, this was actually around 2001, September. Sound familiar to you folks in the US? So it was a big rupture in my life. A bunch of things kind of happened at once. And then that was also like this larger political thing that was happening. And I would say at that time is when joy got politicized for me. It was this thing of like, I'm just going to put out joy and think about joy, and you know, it kind of became my handle, Joyful Carla. Yeah, so it's a very long story. So that's 2001. So life goes on. At that time, I decided to really root myself in community and in parenting, and embracing a different way of being with my child, and encouraging and supporting his autonomy. So we joined an alternative education project, and just went from there. And then I ended up working with youth in another project called the Purple Thistle Center, which was founded by Matt Hearn and Six Youth in 2001 as well. But I didn't start really hanging out there till about 2007. I became the co-director in 2009. Anyways, it was, you know, a project that really centered thriving and youth autonomy, and we were there to support that intersection of art and activism. And I was making a documentary film about the project with my co-director, Corin Brown. And I was interviewing Richard Day for it. And then he was making a documentary at the same time. So he interviewed me, and I was telling him about the Thistle. And he said, wow, that sounds like joyful militancy. And this was in, I think, 2011. And I was like, bing!
There it is.
What is joyful militancy? Oh my gosh. And so we kind of ran with it at the Thistle. We made screen prints and blah, 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 blah. And then I had known Nick since 2011. I actually met Richard through him. And we put in a grant for Institute for Anarchist Studies to write an essay on joyful militancy and got funded, and started interviewing people. And about a year and a half later, we're like, wow, this is way bigger than an essay. So by then I was actually on the board of IAS, and we just put in a proposal for a book for the interventions book series, and we got it. And so it was just a very lived, personal politicizing of the word joy. It was really connected to my parenting, to youth, supporting youth to have an autonomous, powerful life and thriving life, and then just all intersected. And there was also, alongside all these kind of joyful eruptions around the world, from Occupy to Arab Spring and all that, alongside that, we were seeing an increase of call-out culture, an increase of disposable relationship stuff happening within movements. And so we just, and these, I think we write about it in our intro, like these conversations were happening really privately and really quietly for quite a few years, about like, how do we deal with this rigid radicalism that's coming about. So we decided to tackle it and write about it.
To address it in the book.
Yeah.
I really love how much joy has been like a central motivator in your life. And that's fantastic. I notice how when you write about the empire, which is, you know, basically capitalism, just oppressive government forces, these systems kind of minimize joy and create what you talk about as sadness.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, why would anyone want to be part of the empire when this is happening, when it minimizes your capacity for joy? Right.
I mean, it's not, I mean, it's stuff that happens to us from really early on, this idea of subjugation. I mean, I think it's interesting that well, I don't think it's, I mean, partly why I work around parenting and children's, like I have a hashtag called Solidarity Begins at Home. It's because I think it really gets rooted really early on in kids' lives. They live a tremendously consentless life, from being touched to being forced to touch, to eating, to forced to sleep. I mean, these are ways that the body gets subjugated really early on. And then even in the most radical homes, then, you know, we live in this oppressive world, this world that kind of despises children or distrusts children in lots of ways. And so children continue to be subjugated. So there's a real practical way that this happens. It's not this weird thing that's outside of ourselves. And I think where I really learned about this idea of subjugation being something that happens to our physical body, but it's also in our brains, is through reading Orwell, you know, because it's the thoughts too. And then we're just brought into it. into the empire way of being, and we do it,
Right. And
we
we've known
replicate it.
nothing else.
Yeah, we know nothing else. We replicate it in our relationships. Um, and then of course, oppression is the axes of different oppressions of where you sit with your access and power as a whole other part of that. But subjugation is something that starts really early on. So I don't think it's about like us buying into it. I think it's like just it's embodied.
Unlearning. I
Yeah.
think I watched your Purple Thistle documentary, you talk about deschooling so
Yeah.
much, which I think is really important, but also seems like a tremendous amount of work to convince someone that what they've been raised in is oppressive.
Yeah.
Like, how is there a way to do deschooling at scale in kind of a mass way?
No, I don't think so. And in fact, the person who, I mean, he didn't even coin the phrase, it got sort of put on him, Ivan Illich, he wrote the book Deschooling Society, which wasn't the title he wanted. And he immediately wrote a new book right after called, oh my gosh, Escaping Education or something like that. So it's not something that can just go hugely systemic. It has to start really small because people are so deeply schooled, and it's pretty global at this point. Obviously, there's, this is where it gets nuanced and complex, but there's a really good documentary called Schooling the World that I recommend. And yeah, I think like to me, deschooling, there's kind of two pieces to it. There's like the psychological undoing of what schooling did to you, whether it entrenched this idea of no longer being curious or being competitive or all those kind of things that get sedimented in early on in school. And then there's like the act of it, of living a life outside of the confines of a curriculum-based education system. And that to me is more what John Holt called unschooling. Or some people call it home learning or life learning. It's this idea of like the learner has agency over what they learn and how they learn. And that sometimes can be in schools, outside of schools, a mix of schooling and unschooling or odd schooling, if you want to call it, whatever. Right. My kids have they've done a mix of it all. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is just it has to happen on the small scale, which looks like it's what you did at the Purple Thistle. And other people, I guess, are trying to mimic it and make it happen. There's like one of the things, there's so many amazing projects around the world. So it's people can just start, life without schooling, unschooling, deschooling. These are kind of the catchphrases, but it's all over the world. It's not there's a belief, this happens with anarchism too, that it's all white people and middle-class people. And this is not true. I mean, I'm working class. I know a lot of, I don't want to get all testimony and anecdotal, but right. I think that people who immediately throw it onto like a white middle class privilege thing, I wonder about who their circle is. Like who do right. because like it's so many Black women in the US unschool their children. It's because they know that school is very damaging. It's a white supremacy environment. It's small scale, but it needs to connect to other struggles and the intersections. And I guess why I think like what was cool about the Purple Thistle is it ran after school hours because it was for all kids, because most kids need to be somewhere during the day, especially under the age of 15. Parents have to work. So it's really connected to capitalism and other systems, right? Not everyone can. Some kids need to get away from their parents. Let's just be honest. Right? So like school's actually safer for them than their home, right? So it's just very nuanced. It's not a quick fix. I think the overlap with what I do is I work with young people who are trying to basically make their own living on the internet. And it's almost a shift between like traditional schooling and deschooling, because they suddenly have to teach themselves a tremendous amount of stuff.
Neat.
And so what I loved seeing about the Purple Thistle, and also with the people that I work with, is that it's these young people who are converts who realize, oh no, I need to make my own curriculum now.
Right.
Which is really exciting and like is work to be done. I know that mainly I'm working with artists who are creating, shops and web presences on the internet. I'm curious what the youth in your circles are working on and what they're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic's kind of changed things a lot. That's amazing work. I'm glad to hear you're doing that.
Thanks.
Yeah, and the other, it reminded me that self-directed learning is the other kind of buzzwords that people can find out more about this. Yeah, I mean, I'm not working directly with youth outside of a few right now on Grounded Futures project. And because of the pandemic, and because I started doing more work as an artist myself. Like,
great.
I wouldn't call it solo artist. It's like solo together. I've been calling it, making films and whatnot. So it's been less and less. So but yeah, I think what you're offering is amazing. What I see with the Zoomer crowd that I know is that they are so internet set. Like, they can just make videos like instantly, and they can do so much creative, like make comics. So the young people in my life primarily are in the LGBTQ plus communities, and so the internet is really important to them. We have a podcast that we're doing. Yeah, I don't know.
What's your relationship with the internet? Do you feel like you're a bit of behind the times or with it?
It was funny. My older son told me that I use the internet like a millennial. So I don't know if that's a compliment, or because I'm an
That sounds like a compliment, but it depends on who you are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that I'm not like I've been on the internet since I think my first email was, I was like 25 or something. I was in the late 80s. So I was not a latecomer to it. Mind you, no one else was on email, so it was chat rooms. That's about it. And I've used the different social media platforms. I tend to quit them all. I'm not a big fan. I like Instagram for some reason. Probably because I'm a very visual person. I definitely, I know how to use, I guess part of what he was saying is that I do know how to use it for, quote unquote branding or marketing. I don't know. Right. That's kind of a millennial skill. Apparently.
I guess, kind of.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not scared of it. I know how to make websites a little bit.
Yeah, that's, I think I'm just curious because, like you said, young people are very savvy at the internet. And I think whenever I look at the news, it's like, whoever breaks into Twitter, it's usually a 16-year-old. And I just hope that like young people, and from what I've seen, they're using these skills to like amplify their own personal joy through self-directed learning.
Yeah.
What, like, in terms of your work, tell me more about Grounded Futures, because is that like interviewing young people, or what's the
so yeah, so this project kind of is kind of the two, and like all my life there's always like a bunch of different nuanced things coming together. So my 16-year-old last year during the school strikes for climate that were going on, he was feeling pretty frustrated with how narrow the conversation was for youth. Like, you were allowed to be out protesting, and that was about it. And so he really wanted to have conversations about, how do we survive and thrive amid capitalism, ongoing capitalism, and what if it can't be stopped? What are we doing to build community, to build systems of resilience, to build systems of thriving? So, I mean, he's been raised in this home, so we're not all about prefiguration, but it's a big part of our lives.
Right.
So Nick actually was involved with this conversation, and we were going to have workshops with our community, mostly young people, but all ages, tackling this conversation because youth want to talk about this stuff. And then the pandemic hit. At the same time, I was working with a couple of folks, Jamie Lee Gonzalez and Melissa Roach, on creating a multimedia platform to train young folks and women and non-binary folks to create and make their own media, whether it was through video or podcasting, basically amplifying everyday thriving is kind of the idea. And so the world's connected. The goal is to, once the pandemic's over, is to do a lot of this in person, training and skill training. And this kind of connects to my work for the last decade. I've been doing this in different mediums.
It's like spreading the word.
Yeah. And the
and
idea
encouraging conversation.
Yeah. And give the skills, right? Give the skills over in an autonomous way. A lot of BIPOC folks and LGBTQ folks are left out of the institutions that train people how to do this. It's often too expensive. So we got a grant, an emergency funding grant under COVID to start a youth-run podcast, and that is the Grounded Futures Show. And because of the podcast and because of this intersection of this conversation I had with my son last year, I'm working with him and his partner. Both are two trans young folks, because his partner's in our pod, the pandemic pod. And so we're doing shows, and they're talking to older folks who live, kind of radical lives or do cool stuff. And they're talking to them about, how.
Yeah, downloading that information.
Yeah, how do you thrive in the everyday, despite capitalism and ongoing colonialism and whatnot. So that's one show. And then I have another show with Eleanor Goldfield, who's in the US, called it's called Silver Threads. Still Walking, Still Waking. And it's a kind of a continuation of the book, Joyful Militancy, because we are interviewing long-term radicals, hence Silver Threads, and about, how to share a bit of their story of how they became a radical, how they became an organizer, to share some of the humility along the way, the learning, the flailing, because we're at a moment in history where there's an upsurge of people joining movements, arriving on the scenes. And alongside that, as always, there's an uptick of rigid radicalism. So we wanted to interrupt or intervene on that conversation and share voices from people who, I think, long-term activists that a lot of people look up to and think they've always been, quote unquote woke. Mm-hmm. And having them share, no, I haven't. Here's some of
this
my
was
story.
A process.
And I'm still learning, and I'm always learning, I'm always learning, especially from young folks. So that show is twice a month. You can find it on all the podcast things. And then Grounded Future Show with the youth, it's once a month, the third Sunday.
This
sounds
yeah.
Go ahead.
This sounds like meaningful work, which is good for joy, good for the soul. But I find that when I do meaningful work, ways to get paid from it either cloud the vision or make it impossible. How do you balance the needs of capitalism with doing this meaningful work?
Yeah, so right away, the main thing that needs to be acknowledged here is that I have a partner who does a day job, is working class, works for a cable company. A lot of people don't know that story about our family. That's he's not to me, he's the working class hero. But he would be uncomfortable with that statement, but it is a bit of a sacrifice. And it was part of the decision when we decided to take this alternative path with our kids to unschool and to follow their predilections, their needs, their desires to have an autonomous zone in our home. Required me to be home a lot. And so I did a lot of volunteerism and did a lot of the work, community work, with really little to no pay throughout my 40s. Was that smart? Probably not. Are we living precariously? Totally. Do we own a house? No. So, I'm holding out for capitalism to empire to crash. So,
right.
We're all going to be in the same boat.
I don't think you're alone in that.
Yeah. And then the other thing, through mentorship from other people, particularly Matt Hearn at the Thistle and other folks, I learned how to grant write. I learned how to do it in a really authentic way, honest way. I don't, you know, you hear people, radical artists and radical folks say that, you know, they change they change everything in the grants so that, and then they have to compromise their project to fit in. I don't do that. Like, I'm very upfront to what I'm doing. I mean,
Right.
creating projects that is at the core about young people thriving. Everyone wants to fund that.
Right.
Most people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been able to bring in a little bit of pay that way. It's sometimes minimal, sometimes it's really good. I also, as I was saying earlier, after all these years of doing work, it's built up to me becoming a senior artist. And so I now, as an individual, can get funding. Canada is pretty good at arts funding, and I can get funding to make films. And the work that brings me personally a lot of joy. I've been really grateful to get that kind of funding, so that the more activist work, community work that I do on, like I have this project called Solidarity Housing that I do with Nick Montgomery.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we can do that for less pay because it's, you know, it's just all part of it.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, it's, you know, it's a juggling act.
It is a juggling act.
And compromising.
Yeah.
How about
measuring values.
Yeah.
In my work with young people, I asked them, I was like, what do you value? Because you're going to balance what you do based on that. And a lot of them can't answer. They're like, oh, I don't want to think about that. So it's definitely an ongoing process when you realize, oh, I need to sacrifice one thing if I'm going to pursue this thing that I care very much about.
Yeah.
What have you been doing to bring yourself joy during this like fall, winter?
Yeah, I mean, working on Silver Threads and Grounded Futures has been really helpful, like having
Mm-hmm.
these conversations, especially during the last couple months, like talking with folks in the US, primarily for Silver Threads, Indigenous and Black folks who, you know, their life was, they were living under an immense amount of shittiness pre-Trump, during
Mm-hmm.
Trump, and post-Trump. And so like having these conversations with folks who don't center elections or center the presidency, but talk more about empire and about oppression and about thriving amid that and about creating alternatives has been just the most wonderful thing. I feel really grateful to these folks to have these conversations. You know, my 26-year-old is one of my best friends in the world, and he was living in England doing his MA, and he had to come home because of the pandemic. So having him home is probably, the silver lining.
Nice.
Yeah.
What do you hope to see more of in 2021? Like, what do you think that people like you, me, and our friends can do to, I guess, dismantle empire, honestly?
I mean, these conversations, thank you for doing them. I think that's important. More listening, more trusting each other, more showing up with care and love. I know that sounds cliche, but really it's, I'm just not in this to convince people. I don't really care if you're socialist, anarchist, whatever, ist. In fact, it'd be great if you weren't an ist. More uprisings on the streets. I think more, just listening and these conversations, more conversations and finding ways to thrive.
Yeah, I think we're hopefully on the right track. All of us have been looking out for each other.
I mean, the mutual aid stuff's been incredible. Can I plug a book that I was part of that's speaking of mutual aid?
Absolutely. I was about to ask. I want to know about books that you're excited about, people that inspire you. What's this one you're holding? Pandemic?
So this is called Pandemic Solidarity, Mutual Aid During the COVID-19 Crises, forward by Rebecca Solnit It was edited by Marina Citrin and a collective of folks all over the world, which I was lucky enough to be part of. Really early on, it's out from Pluto Press.
Great.
Really early on in the pandemic, Marina reached out to me and asked if I would help or do a chapter on Canada. I said I would like to do that, but I think it'd be better if it was Turtle Island. So I collaborated with someone in the US, and we did a Turtle Island, which included Mexico. And there's a chapter on Taiwan, a chapter on Korea, Turkey, Greece, Italy, Rojava, Iraq, England, Brazil, Portugal, Argentina. I feel like I'm missing some, but you can see like, so, and it's a book about and it's filled with interviews with people doing mutual aid all over the world. So super inspiring.
I've been like encountering the term mutual aid more and more. And of course, it sounds like something I can get behind. It sounds just like people helping each other.
Yeah, cooperation.
And so like part of me wants to be like, yeah, we should do more mutual aid, but I want to make sure like I'm understanding it. Is it just like being a community?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that it's true. It has become like this word, this saying that's being like everything gets captured by capitalism and nonprofits and kind of molded into something that's not. So it just essentially means cooperation, right? So it's not an economic system at all. Like that's where people get conflated. They conflate. Peter Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist, was a naturalist way back. He was really frustrated with how Darwinism was misunderstood, because Darwin actually proved that cooperation was more what animals do, but it got
but capitalism pulled survival of the fittest,
and and empire and other people. So Kropotkin wrote a book called Mutual Aid and if you go through it, he basically is trying to show that him and Darwin agreed. He used the word solidarity and mutual aid interchangeable. So this idea that it's not the charity, it's like everyone is taken care of, you take care of each other with your resources, which includes everything, right? No one goes without. One of his, I read it 30 years ago or whatever. At the beginning of the pandemic, I reread the book because I knew something was going to happen around it getting messed up of what it means. And there's this part that always stuck with me. He was talking about like at the brink, and Sylvia Federici talks about this too, sort of at the brink of revolt in England and Europe. The state, before the state really clamped down, so people lived in a very differently, right? Mutual aid was something, and solidarity was something that was happening everywhere all the time. It was normal. Like, so he talks about it, for an example, the normal way to behave in public. If you were sitting down to eat food, you would ask if anyone around is hungry and did they need some food, right? So this was kind of the practices of the everyday, right? And people were really organizing and coming together and helping each other, and the oligarchy, the ruling class, saw that that there was a brink of revolts, and there was tiny revolts happening. So the state and the corporate, whatever, they weren't corporate yet, but the oligarchy, came up with this idea of charities as a way to undermine solidarity, to undermine mutual aid that was just happening in between people. And so they literally created soup kitchens and things and such, and said, you don't need to help each other anymore. We've got it. The state's going to take care of it.
Fascinating.
So it's like, when I hear folks say that they want to institutionalize mutual aid or solidarity and make it, and like, it's already been done, it's called charities, and it undermines this social bonds that we have with each other, through care, through sharing resources, through cooperation, that is not extractive at all, that's rooted in reciprocity, You know, Indigenous folks talk about this all the time on Turtle Island, that that's where they come from. And it brings me to the topic that I care most about, is like, how can we undo this extraction model, which is in our relationships. It's at the center of capitalism. And I would argue that it's the center of, it's a part of any economic system. You know, like this idea.
Is it where they take the good thing and they sell it?
Yeah, or it's not reciprocity, right?
Uh-huh.
It's a taking and not giving back. It's, you know, so I'm just more interested in, like I joke that I am no-ist, except for maybe a mutual aidist.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think, you know, I just know that we can live that way. I know that I live that way with my friends and kin and family.
Yeah, it sounds like it starts on a personal level. And I think our gut
point,
reaction is to, like, I guess like even in tech startup spheres, I live in Seattle, and people are like, how can this operate at scale? If it doesn't operate at scale, what are you doing? And the truth of the matter is what you're talking about is it's an incredibly personal journey to like decide to like provide mutual aid and solidarity. It's not a systemic thing. It's like a spiritual awakening.
Yeah, I mean the opposite of all this is competition, right? And so and greed and growth, you know, growing, you know, all the capitalism sort of ideas, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, how do you survive under capitalism, thrive without being extractive? And I think if we could start with our relationships, we'd, you know, like there's all these calls that have been around forever, like people over profit, right?
Right.
But I'm like, people over projects. Like we have to like I just know so many people, you know, there's so many organizations that don't do that. They're more interested in the cause than they are into each other. And if we're extracting from each other and competing with each other, like mutual aid is not happening at all in those moments. I don't care if everyone's getting fed. If you're treating each other like crap, it's acceptable.
Then you failed.
You failed. Yeah.
We're nearing the end of our time.
Great.
I'm curious, is there any books or people you recommend that we look into? Anyone you follow on Twitter that you're a fan of?
I think if you want to learn more about mutual aid, I think like Cleve and Ellie and the Indigenous mutual aid, like they do some really great work. I know you're in the US, so I was wanting to that. Dean Spade just came out with a book called Mutual Aid before, during, and after COVID that is really good for talking about the theory more than we do. Like ours is more the stories. And I always recommend Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. I think it's a really good timely book. And The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin.
All right, great. I love a reading list. Thank you so much again for coming on the show. It was great talking to you.
Thanks so much for having me, and best of luck to all your work.
Oh, for sure. I will see you on Twitter.
Okay, bye.